The final hours of Kimberly McCarthy inside the mind of Texas' 500th death row inmate. At 6 a.m., inside a silent wing of the Texas Women's Death Row, the guards began their morning rounds. Kimberly McCarthy was already awake. She had been awake for hours. By nightfall, she would become the 500th person executed by the state of Texas, and the last woman put to death there in the 21st century. Once known as a bright, charismatic woman with dreams of helping others, Kimberly's life unraveled through addiction, poor choices, and consequences she could never undo. Now, after decades behind bars, she faced the final day of her life. What goes through a person's mind when there is no appeal left, no delay, and no tomorrow? What thoughts remain when time is measured not in years, but in hours? In this video, we take you inside the final 24 hours of Kimberly McCarthy's life, from her final morning on death row to her last words, revealing a story of regret, reflection, and a quiet acceptance few ever witness. At 6 a.m., Kimberly had already been awake for hours. She had slept little the night before, her mind drifting through memories of her childhood, her career, and the choices that led her here. The warden's soft voice broke the silence. "McCarthy, it's time." Those words marked the beginning of her last day. She was calm, more than many had expected. Over the years, she had learned to live with the weight of her sentence. On this final morning, there was no anger, no fight left in her, just a quiet acceptance. She was escorted to a small holding cell known as the Death Watch Room, just steps away from the execution chamber. The walls were bare, except for a metal bunk and a Bible on the small table. She had spent years reading that same book, page by page, under the harsh fluorescent light. At noon, a guard approached her cell. "It's time to order your last meal," he said gently. Texas had abolished extravagant last meals years earlier, so she was limited to what was available from the prison kitchen. Kimberly requested barbecued ribs, biscuits, and a cup of tea. Simple, comforting food. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, occasionally smiling faintly at the memories of family dinners from decades ago. She later told a chaplain that it wasn't about the food, but about holding on to a sense of normalcy, even for a few moments. Throughout the afternoon, Kimberly received a few letters from her attorney, from a pastor, and from a former prison counselor who had always believed in her potential for change. One letter, handwritten on yellow paper, caught her attention. It was from a woman she had befriended through the prison pen pal program. "You are not defined by your worst act," the letter read. "You are a person who lost her way, but not her humanity." Kimberly folded the letter neatly and pressed it to her chest. Those words, she whispered, were the kindest she had heard in years. At around 4 p.m., she met with the prison chaplain. They spoke softly, reciting verses from the Book of Psalms. She asked him to pray not only for her, but also for the victim's family. "They deserve peace more than I do," she said. "Way, but not her humanity." Those words. At 5:30 p.m., 2 correctional officers entered the holding cell. They were respectful, professional, and quiet. Kimberly stood up, hands trembling slightly as they fastened her wrists in handcuffs. She was led down a long corridor toward the Huntsville unit, where Texas carries out its executions. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the hallway, a slow, heavy rhythm that seemed to mark the passage of time itself. Inside the white-walled execution chamber, the temperature was cold and sterile. The gurney stood in the center, surrounded by medical equipment, an IV line, and 2 separate observation rooms, one for the media, one for witnesses. Kimberly looked around calmly, her gaze steady. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said softly. By 6 p.m., the witnesses began taking their seats behind the thick glass window. On one side sat members of the victim's family, faces solemn and unreadable. On the other, a few reporters prepared their notes, silent and tense. Kimberly's spiritual advisor stood near her, whispering a final prayer. The guards positioned her on the gurney, tightening the leather straps around her ankles, wrists, and torso. Despite the restraints, she remained composed. She looked up at the ceiling, taking a deep breath as the IV line was inserted into her arm. When asked if she had any final statement, Kimberly nodded. Her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the chamber's speakers. "Yes, I do," she said. "To the family of Dorothy Booth, I am so sorry. I hope my death brings you peace. To my own family, I love you all. I pray that God will forgive me and that I'll be remembered not for what I did, but for the woman I tried to be." She paused, exhaled slowly, and added one last sentence: "Peace be with you." At 6:37 p.m., the warden gave the signal. The first chemical, a sedative, began to flow through the IV line. Kimberly blinked once, her lips moving as if in prayer. Within seconds, her body relaxed. Her breathing slowed. A few moments later, she appeared to drift into sleep. At 6:41 p.m., the medical examiner checked her pulse. There was none. The warden turned to the room of witnesses and announced the time of death. The curtains were drawn. The execution was over. Outside the prison walls, a small group of protesters and reporters stood in silence. Some held candles, others signs calling for the end of capital punishment. One woman whispered, "Another life lost, 2 families broken forever." Inside, the chamber was cleaned, reset, and prepared for the next case. For the staff, it was another part of their duty. For Kimberly McCarthy, it was the end of a long, painful journey that began decades before. Her story drew renewed attention to the rarely discussed world of women on death row, a place where only a handful of inmates faced the same fate as their male counterparts. In the weeks following her execution, journalists and advocates revisited her life story, from her early success as a medical worker to her struggles with addiction and poor decisions that led to irreversible consequences. Kimberly McCarthy's case continues to raise uncomfortable questions. Can a person truly change after decades behind bars? Should redemption be possible for those condemned to die? Those who worked with her in her final years described a woman who had come to terms with her past, who spent her days counseling younger inmates, reading the Bible, and reflecting on the person she used to be. Die. To die. In one of her final letters, she wrote, "Don't let my story be about death. Let it be about the choices that lead us there and the grace we find when we finally face ourselves." In the days after Kimberly McCarthy's execution, the number 500 followed her name everywhere. Headlines called her Texas 500th death row inmate. Television anchors repeated it. Commentators debated it. But inside the prison system, those who had known her understood something the numbers could not capture. She was not a milestone. She was a person. Correctional officers who had worked the women's unit for years spoke quietly among themselves. Many admitted that Kimberly's case stayed with them longer than most, not because of the crime, but because of who she became afterward. One officer later said, "She wasn't the same woman who came in, not even close." Over the years, Kimberly had taken on an unofficial role inside the unit. She listened. She comforted. When younger inmates arrived, terrified and disoriented, she would sit with them and say, "You still have a soul. Don't lose it in here." For some, she became the closest thing to a mentor they had ever known. Mental health staff noted that she rarely spoke about fear of death. Instead, she spoke about regret, about wasted time, broken trust, and the quiet grief of knowing there was no path back. "I can't undo it," she once told a counselor. "All I can do is face it honestly." Outside the prison, the public conversation was louder and colder. Some argued that justice had finally been served. Others questioned whether executing a woman who had spent decades transforming herself truly brought closure. Protesters and supporters clashed in interviews, reducing her life to arguments and sound bites. But inside those walls, the silence returned quickly. Her cell was emptied, her letters were cataloged, her Bible was placed into storage. Another inmate would eventually sleep on that same metal bunk, under the same fluorescent light, counting the same slow hours. For the victim's family, the execution marked an end, but not a healing. Grief does not disappear with a sentence carried out. It simply changes shape. Some relatives later said the day brought relief. Others admitted the pain remained, unchanged and permanent. Kimberly seemed to understand that long before her final day. In one conversation with a chaplain weeks before her execution, she said, "People think this ends something. It doesn't. It just stops the clock for me." She asked that her name not be remembered as a symbol, but as a warning about addiction, choices, and the quiet ways a life can unravel. Texas would go on to carry out more executions. New headlines would replace hers. New cases would take center stage. But for those who witnessed Kimberly McCarthy's final hours, Her calm, her words, and her acceptance left a lasting impression. Not because she was the 500th, but because, in the end, she faced her fate as a human being, fully aware, deeply remorseful, and painfully honest about the life she had lived. And inside the walls of a prison built for endings, that honesty may have been the most unsettling thing of all. Human being, fully aware, deeply remorseful, and painfully honest about the life human being.